We'll go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to Cardiology Grid and Rounds. It's really a pleasure to have Dr. Mark Benson from our Cardiology Division speak today. Dr. Benson is the Director of Preventive Cardiology at BIDMC, and he's an Assistant Professor of Medicine at Harvard Medical School. By way of background, Dr. Benson did his undergraduate degree in Columbia in biology. He then went to the University of Michigan to do an MD degree as well as a PhD in pharmacology, after he came over to Boston. I skipped your residency. The residency at Michigan, and then came over to Boston for his cardiology fellowship. And on the wards there, met the illustrious Dr. Benson and decided to use omics technologies as his preferred method of trying to identify new therapeutic targets for his area of clinical interest, which is cardiovascular prevention. So Dr. Benson came over to BIDMC in 2018. He's established a really robust program integrating omics into preventive target discovery, and has published wonderful papers in Circulation, JCI Insight. His program is funded by a K08 award from the NHLBI, as well as grants from Boehringer Ingelheim, as well as Novartis. I'm so really excited to have Dr. Mark Benson join us today to tell us about new pharmacological targets in preventive cardiology.
Thank you, Arnie, and thank you really for the opportunity to present today. So, these are my disclosures. Amgen makes omalizumab, and Boehringer Ingelheim makes those, and I'll talk about both. So, what I wanted to do was start by just providing an update on our prevention program and introduce some new personnel as well as two new programs in hypertension and genetics. And then move on to highlight the idea that there's been a wave of recent developments in many new medicines in prevention, and with 6 new FDA-approved classes of medicines and preventions over the last 7 years. And I'll touch on some of these as well as several new medicines pipeline or a clinical site for 2 upcoming phase 3 trials. And I wanted to make the argument that a lot of this progress is coming from advances, especially in genomics and in high-throughput molecular profiling. And so I was going to end the talk with the idea that building on the success initially in genomics, other emerging high-throughput molecular profiling technologies like proteomics or metabolomics may hopefully hold promise to develop even new therapies in prevention. So this is the Preventive Cardiology team. The whole program sticks together because of incredible work that Ian Shea and Shantoy Moxon, who have incredible relationships with basically every single patient, many of the families of the patients who come through the prevention program. I think a lot of the success of the program really is due to Ian and Shantoy's incredible work. I'm really happy to share that Dr. Lee will be joining the dyslipidemia group starting next month. As many of you well know, Dr. Lee, in addition to having expertise in dyslipidemia, has a really deep interest and expertise, especially in nutrition and other lifestyle modifications. So this will be a huge addition to the group. Every single new patient that's referred to prevention gets to meet with Kate in nutrition, which I think is also immensely helpful for the patients in the program. And then I'll spend a couple of slides just introducing these new programs in preventive genetics and hypertension, which are highly multidisciplinary with members across cardiology and other divisions. So the Complex Hypertension Center at the CDI is just getting launched. It'll be officially launched in the next month or 2. This is a very collaborative project with Dr. Krawitz, Carol, Zemsky in vascular medicine, as well as Dr. Cluett at HCA, as well as the prevention team. This is part of a larger medicine-wide comprehensive hypertension center. And it's notable that this center is an AHA certified comprehensive hypertension center, the only one in New England and only one of 17 nationwide. This is directed by Dr. Kluik. The mission of the Complex Hypertension Center here at the CVI is to serve as a highly multidisciplinary center for the treatment of patients with complex resistant hypertension, and especially focusing on patients who have resistant hypertension at a very early age, or onset at a late age, or you're worried about secondary drivers. This can really serve as kind of an entry point to many of the close collaborations that this group has across nephrology, endocrinology, sleep medicine, endocrine surgery, interventional radiology, interventional cardiology, for ways to diagnose and then manage these complex patients. And the center is also meant to support hypertension-based research. I'll just highlight, of course, Dr. Sosomsky's work with the firm looking at renal nerve denervation in patients with uncontrolled hypertension, as well as Dr. Jurashek's AHA-sponsored Go Fresh trial looking at Black patients in Boston who have hypertension and live in food deserts. There will be, so go live next month, there will be 3 ways to access the Hypertension Center through OMR. You can request a full consult, a one-time second opinion, or just ABPM monitoring without a consult. It's open to just cardiology. I also wanted to introduce the Preventive Cardiology genetic program. This has been, as many of you know, up and running for about a year and a half. This was set up in close collaboration, of course, with Dr. Tahir, part of the larger cardiovascular genetics program, Caitlin Finn, who's a genetic counselor. The purpose of this is to provide evaluation and management of patients with familial hypercholesterolemia and then other heritable cholesterol disorders. And I wanted to just spend a couple slides talking about familial hypercholesterolemia, because this is super important to catch. It's really common. It affects 1 in 250 Americans, and that's because it's autosomal dominant disorder. So all you need is one pathogenic variation in one of 3 genes. Most commonly, that's in the LDL receptor, and that causes the LDL receptor to not be able to clear LDL from the bloodstream as efficiently. So patients are left with very high circulating levels of LDL and then 22-fold increased risk of MI. This is in monogenic FH in untreated individuals. That's due to these individuals having lifelong exposures to very high LDL levels. It's underdiagnosed. It's estimated that 80% of people with FH in the US have not yet been diagnosed with this, and it's really important to catch. It has important implications, obviously, for the program. But one of the big things I want to highlight is the importance that this allows for cascade screening of primary relatives. There's a 50% chance that each primary relative will have the same disease-causing variant. And so in families where we're able to diagnose a pathogenic variant, that is a huge catch in preventive cardiology, because we can almost completely mitigate the associated risk with FH by putting kids and other affected individuals on lipid therapy. So in these families, we start testing kids at age 2 and treating kids with lipid therapy at age 8 to 10. This is in collaboration. We've been really fortunate to establish very tight collaboration with the lipid program at Children's. And I'm just putting up a slide to highlight this idea of cascade screening. This is a family that I saw with Caitlin in clinic. This is a 68-year-old who had coronary disease and CABG at age 64 and an LDL at that time of 197. She was intolerant to statins, so really came to us on therapy. And we did genetic testing, found that she had a very common actual pathogenic variant, the LDL receptor. And this was enough to convince her to start a PCSK9 inhibitor. Excuse me. And so that obviously is incredibly important for her, but of almost equal importance, that allowed us to then do cascade screening in her sister and her 3 kids, each of whom had a 50% chance of having FH as well, and were on no lipid-lowering therapy. It turned out that one son and one daughter had the same pathogenic variant. They're now on lipid-lowering therapy, and that in turn has super important implications on the program's grandkids who are now undergoing cascade screening as well as her sister's kids. So and I think it's reasonable to consider referral. Yeah.
To ask for a question, what's the reimbursement at this point for doing
It's good. It's pretty good. So
it's not just that.
no, it's Caitlin works very closely with. We do almost all of our genetic testing over in detail, and there's some details in this, but
Patients aren't getting settled.
it's very, very rare. So if it's going to be the way it works is they'll call the patient. It's going to be more than $100 or $200 out of pocket, which is rare, and then the patient can settle. So it's I think it's very reasonable to consider referral for genetic testing for FH in patients who have very high LDL cholesterol above 250 with no obvious secondary driver for this, as well as patients who have LDLs above 190 and a family history either of early dyslipidemia or premature ASCVD, or even an LDL above 160 and you're worried about the patient. They have a family history and a personal history of premature ASCVD, et cetera.
The LDL cholesterol that you see patients in clinic, high LDL, do you consider, I mean, it's kind of like age index a little bit, because if you see a 30-year-old with like 190, 180, see a 60-year-old.
Yeah, I think so. So anybody who has an LDL above 190, there should at least be kind of a yellow light that flag in your mind that's thinking about FH. That I would put it another way. In younger patients, I think the thing that gets missed. So oftentimes we'll see young patients who have very high LDLs, and it's because of terrible diets. And so what we'll actually do is usually have them meet with nutrition, let them kind of redouble lifestyle for 6 months and test them. And a significant portion of those people, like 20-year-olds, will get better. But if they persistently have high LDLs above 190, then that's concerning. The other thing I'd say is we see a lot of like young 20, people in their young 20s. In those people, the kind of flag should go off in LDLs above 160. Because as you said, you get progressively higher LDLs. I just wanted to highlight too that we do genetic testing for hypertriglyceridemia. We're looking specifically for familial chylomicronemia syndrome, which is really, really rare. It's like 1 in a million rare. This is because it's recessive. The reason that this is becoming more important to test for is because it can help discriminate between treatment with some emerging therapies, anti-ApoC3 and anti-ANGPTL3 therapies, for example, are dependent on on your genotype. And so we've been starting to test for that specifically, especially as we're more involved with anti-ApoC3 therapies. It's reasonable to consider referral for genetic testing in patients who have severely elevated triglycerides above 885, especially if they have a history of pancreatitis and especially if they're young. So I just wanted to kind of move on to this idea that there's been this recent wave of a whole bunch of new therapies. And I put together this slide to try to highlight the idea that I think a lot of this progress is coming from advances in translational medicine, and especially advances in technologies that are identifying important targets that are associated with ASCVD. So for example, in the early part of this last century, advances in biochemistry identified a tie between cholesterol and ASCVD, and that led to the development of a whole bunch of medicines that targeted cholesterol. as you know, in the second part of the century, advances in molecular biology identified the HMG-CoA reductase enzyme, LDL receptor, et cetera, that led to subsequent development of medicines that specifically targeted those enzymes and transporters and other molecular biology targets. And in the last 15 years, advances in high throughput molecular profiling, especially in genomics, have identified genes that are important in dyslipidemia and type A ASCVD. And that has led in turn to the development of several new classes of medicines that are engineered specifically to target these pathogenic genes. So what I wanted to do is just highlight, just kind of provide a very brief update on a few of these new targets, starting with bempedoic acid. Bempedoic acid, of course, has been in the news because of the cardiovascular outcomes trial that they got released 2 weeks ago. But I just wanted to make the point that bempedoic acid has actually been around for a long time. It was designed as a fatty acid mimetic to modulate metabolism of acetyl coenzyme A, which is right upstream of HMG-CoA reductase, which of course is the target of statins. And development got waylaid as Pfizer bought Aspirion got respun off, et cetera. But 10 or 12 years later, it was found that bempedoic acid lowered LDL significantly by 20 to 25% in patients. And what's very interesting about bempedoic acid is that it's a prodrug. And so it relies on a specific enzyme that's really only expressed in the liver to become active. And the idea behind this is that because this enzyme is not expressed in skeletal muscle, peripheral tissue, et cetera, it may be that bempedoic acid doesn't have as many side effects, specifically on myalgias. So 3 weeks ago, the uptake, even though this is approved by the FDA for LDL lowering in 2020, the uptake has been really slow as people waited for cardiovascular outcomes data. This just got released 3 weeks ago. This is a really interesting trial. Just wanted to highlight a couple points of the trial. What this trial looked at was patients treated for primary and secondary ASCVD prevention that were statin intolerant. So none of these patients were on statins, and the very few patients who were on statins were on really low doses of statins. They could tolerate less than Rasuva 5 a day or Torpa 10 a day. And so when they looked at those patients who were not on statins, treatment with bempedoic acid over 5 years significantly reduced 4-point MACE as well as fatal or non-fatal MI. But this came with a cost. They had increased adverse events. Most notably, hyperuricemia occurred in almost 11% of patients. Gout was increased with bempedoic acid. Renal impairment was increased as well as cholelithiasis and elevated LFTs. It is notable that, consistent with this whole kind of driving mechanism, myalgias for bempedoic acid were lower than placebo, so there is some potential promise there. I think it will have to see. There's certainly some challenges. It's been difficult to use bempedoic acid because of the PA process, it's expensive, et cetera. We'll have to see how things turn out after these new data. I think that based on this, it's reasonable that in patients who cannot tolerate a statin, that bempedoic acid may be a first-line choice for patients that you're treating for primary prevention. I think it's still a secondary choice for primary prevention in that age. Secondary prevention is PCSK9 is able to lower the LDL more effectively and has less side effects. It's a third-line choice for secondary prevention in patients with statins.
In your practice, do you start bempedoic acid monotherapy, or do you combine it with ezetimibe, which is now available in a combo pill, I guess?
Yeah.
Given the LDL lowering with bempedoic acid is kind of modest, whereas combination with ezetimibe, I think, based on some of these data you showed, is comparable to moderate dose statin.
We've been using bempedoic acid only before these data. We've been using bempedoic and can't tolerate steady for whatever reason. It's like a teeny.
Just
That's that. I mean,
It's only for primary
there's
prevention.
very few people in the system on bempedoic acid. Very few. So we'll just have to see what happens.
So when the studies were being done, people looked at the NPC1 variants, right, the target of this uptake thing. And they said, oh, wow, there are variants that are associated with lower cholesterol and they're associated with less atherosclerosis. That trial is going to be positive as long as there aren't any funny,
Yeah.
effects. So how about this acyl-CoA enzyme?
Variants in it.
Yeah.
Their GWAS data. Yeah.
I don't know the genetic variant, but are those variants in turn associated with less ACVD and nothing else too, right?
Yeah.
Or
that was-
myalgia,
So what's weird, the reason I kind of backed up and showed that this has been in development for so many years is this didn't, unlike the other drugs I'm going to highlight, this didn't come from GWAS studies. It came more from like classic trying to make genetics of what was I going to say? The thing about this trial is, I mean, it was destined to probably work because the patients walked in at high risk for ASCVD and LDLs in like the 130s, 140s because they weren't on a statin. So basically anything that was going to drive their LDL down was probably going to work. And that's what we saw.
But the enzyme data.
The enzyme data is not as strong as stuff.
Would it potentially lower the efficacy of a statin?
No, it's a good question. No, it works with a statin. There's not data yet to say that you should use this with a statin. The one concern that people have is there's a super weak signal that if you combine it with a statin, it may actually make people have more myalgias on a statin. But that's like a very weak signal, and people don't know what to do. This is not recommended by the guidelines, but I think that it's reasonable. What we've been doing is checking the uric acid and the creatinine and LFTs before and a month after starting the med, just to err on the side of caution.
What is the thought mechanism behind kidney injury or the liver?
Yeah, it's a good question. I actually don't know what the cause of that is. Yeah, I'm not sure that it's figured out. So I wanted to move on just briefly and highlight a couple of these therapies that have been identified through GWAS and start, of course, with PCSK9. PCSK9 inhibition inhibits lysosomal mediated degradation of the LDL receptor and allows for recycling of the LDL receptor, increased LDL receptor on the plasma membrane, and subsequently increased clearance of circulating LDL. And it's just, this is the story that I think we're all very aware of, that is just an incredible story in translational medicine, where it was only in 2003 that PCSK9 was identified. Gain of function variants in a large French family were identified to have high LDL levels. And 2 years later, Helen Hobbs and Jonathan Cohen looked at participants in the Texas Heart study and saw that patients who had damaging variants of PCSK9 had lower LDL levels compared to participants who did not have that damaging variant. And Eric showed that they had those patients with damaging variants of PCSK9 had lower coronary disease compared to participants who didn't. We fast forward 16 years and we already have the results of an 8-year extension study on anti-PCSK9 monoclonal antibodies like evolocumab that clearly show that inhibition of PCSK9 leads to a 50 to 60% reduction in circulating LDL levels. They're safe. They significantly reduce MACE as well as even cardiovascular death at 5 years. What's interesting, what I wanted to highlight is that Rob and I were actually just talking about this for the talk, is because PCSK9 is now such a highly validated target, and because it's in the liver, which is so accessible to pharmacological therapy, there are now more than 10 drugs in the pipeline to target PCSK9 in various ways. I'll just highlight a couple of these. Merck just announced at ACC that they developed an oral peptide against PCSK9 that's effectively lowers LDL by more than 6%, phase 2 trials. Verve Therapeutics, which is Boston-based, of course, started by Kat Brayson, just announced last summer that they dosed the first human of CRISPR-based gene therapy against PCSK9. Vaccinity has been just announced last week that they dosed the first human with an anti-PCSK9 vaccine. This is incredibly interesting because, as opposed to these kind of fancy technologies, the idea behind this is scalable and really cheap. And so this could actually be rolled out to a very large population.
Mark, how do you take that peptide?
The Merck's,
The Merck's.
it's oral, is it?
Oral, and how often? Ish.
I think it's daily, but I could be wrong.
And they just really need an update. I think his wife is working on this now.
I can't speak due to conflicts of interest.
Dr. Datos, when are you going part-time?
I did want to highlight inclisiran. This is an siRNA against PCSK9. It was actually approved a year and a half ago, but it doesn't have cardiovascular outcomes data. And so I just, the idea behind this is siRNA lowers the expression of PCSK9. Phase 3 trials have shown that this leads to a 45% reduction in LDL. But we, as long as co-site PIs, Dr. Carroll and Dr. Gelfand, working with Jennifer Kaufman and Tyler Hardy, are one of our site for a randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trial looking at the impact of the 2-point MACE in patients with established ASCVD and LDLs above 70, even on a statin. And I just wanted to make the point that this population of patients, they really should be on monoclonal monoclonal antibody, which has, as I just outlined, has solid cardiovascular outcomes data behind them. This is really the standard of care. So if, this is my opinion, but if you have patients that you have tried to put on the pathway, but they can't be on these meds, either because of tolerances or insurance or whatever, those patients would be great for this trial. So feel free to email me or talk to the health manager. I just wanted to also introduce one other trial, an ApoC3 inhibitor. This is ApoC3 has an incredible story of how this got developed, but ApoC3, very large GWAS studies have now repeatedly shown that ApoC3 inhibits lipoprotein lipase. And when you inhibit ApoC3 genetically or pharmacologically, it allows LPL to hydrolyze triglycerides and lowers triglycerides. It's also been shown to be causal in ASCVD, and so there's a huge effort around anti-ApoC3 for primary and secondary prevention. I'm just showing that siRNA to target ApoC3 can lower triglycerides by more than 60% in phase 2 trials. And so we're really, along with Drs. Middleman and Etchen and Jan Kaufman and Tyler Hardy, we're now, we'll be, in about a month, will be a site for randomized double-blind phase 3 trial looking at this anti-ApoC3 percentage change in fasting triglycerides. This would be a big deal because, as you all know, there really aren't effective therapies treating patients with severe hypertriglyceridemia. The fibrates and fish omega-3 fatty acids, et cetera, become less effective, especially when triglycerides get above 1,000. So this would give us a tool to be able to treat those patients. If you have patients who are over 18, their fasting triglycerides are above 500, and they're on stable lipid-lowering therapy, and their diabetes is under relatively good control, those are great patients for this study, and so they're contacting us. And then I wanted to just kind of end this session with a quick update on Lp(a). As I think we're all familiar, Lp(a) is basically an LDL particle that has this ApoA, this sticky thrombotic apolipoprotein A stuck onto it. It has been known for quite a while to be associated with atherosclerosis, likely through several mechanisms, including thrombosis. What's interesting about LPA is, I think we're aware, is that as opposed to the rest of the cholesterol profile, 90% of circulating levels of Lp(a) are dictated by genetics. And so a patient Lp(a) levels are behaved genetically. There's very modest influences environmentally, but this is really a genetic predisposition to ASCVD. And I just wanted to put a couple slides up. These are relatively new data looking at 460,000 participants in the UK Biobank, and with a follow-up of 11 years. And what was interesting about this when they were able to look at this many patients is that the risk of circulating Lp(a) with increasing levels on the x-axis and increasing ASCVD risk on the y-axis is linear with Lp(a) levels. And so for every 50 points that your Lp(a) goes up, your hazard ratio goes up by 11%. That wasn't, it took a lot of patients to be able to find that linear association. What's interesting is that also in this study, 12% of the population had Lp(a)s above 150. Our lab reports abnormal Lp(a)s as above 75. And in this population, so 12% of the population had an Lp(a) above 150. And so, we see a lot of referrals for elevated Lp(a)s, and I think the way that I think it may be reasonable to think of this is that Lp(a) is really a risk enhancer for most people, and that's consistent with what the AHA and ACC guidelines would promote. And patients who you calculate, risk using a pooled cohort equation, and they're at either borderline or intermediate risk, 5 to 20% calculated from your risk of ASCVD. Lp(a) levels above 125 or 150, whatever the cut line you want to use, should really serve as a risk enhancer and may kind of bump you toward thinking about starting a statin if you're wavering in this kind of borderline population. Now, there is a population who have severely elevated Lp(a)s. The top 1% of population in the UK Biobank had a median Lp(a) of 394. And it's been estimated in prior MR studies that once you reach an Lp(a) of about 400, you have about an equal lifetime ASCVD risk to somebody who has heterozygous FH. So I think this is also beyond the guidelines, but I think it's reasonable, and certainly what we've been doing is when patients have very severely elevated Lp(a)s around 400, there's, wherever you draw this cut point, 350, 400, it's reasonable, in my opinion, to start those patients on a statin and maybe aspirin for primary prevention, regardless of their calculated risk.
Mark, UK Biobank, how many patients had very low levels of Lp(a), and does it mean anything? Yeah, I've never, because it looks like, looks like it's mildly protective. I don't know how many patients there are.
So the standard thought has been that when you're below, the reason that the lab reports 75 in our, that's a common.
I'll specify, I just recently saw 2 primary prevention patients, just happened to be a couple, so figure out whether they're doing something else at home that I don't know about, but their levels are reported as under 17, which is, I think, the lower limit of what our lab reports. And I've never seen this before.
Yeah.
I don't know what to do with it.
I don't think people know the answer to that. It's always been said that there's no increase, there's no change in risk until you get 75, but I don't know if
Was that the bottom line of the was there a lot of people clustered there?
we can see in the next slide.
Oh, so Actually,
So it goes, yeah, so it's a skewed distribution, and so this is not the UK Biobank, but this is a similar population. You can see this very skewed population.
Good morning, John. It's Ann Shea calling. All right. No problem. Sorry you're not feeling well.
Yeah. One of the big problems is I think we're all aware in treating LPA, and now there's, 5 years ago, a series of large Mendelian randomization trials came out that each showed that LPA was not just a passive biomarker of ASCVD risk, but looked to be really causally associated with ASCVD risk, and that really sparked several very large pharmaceutical companies started pipelines looking at ways to lower Lp(a) because we just haven't had tools to be able to lower Lp(a), and that's what I'm showing here is that available tools really just modestly lower Lp(a), and MR trials in niacin, et cetera, as well as MR studies have really hinted that a 30 to 35% reduction in Lp(a) probably is not going to have a huge clinical impact. This was really deeply looked at because PCSK9 inhibitors were found to have about 30 to 35% reduction in Lp(a). The idea is that you need a much bigger decrease in Lp(a) than clinically relevant, and that probably needs to be more in the ballpark of 80 to 90%. So there are really no therapies to do that.
So, Mark, in addition to all the athero stuff, Chris O'Donnell showed in that big genome scan a long time ago that was associated with calcific.
Yeah.
Whatever that is. Anybody look
Yeah.
at it?
So
In the UK Biobank, is there not?
that was not.
To get a
I'm not. I haven't seen that. But obviously, the companies that are developing this are all thinking about that. Yeah. But I actually haven't seen anything about that.
Right, I'm still stuck on your comment that Lp(a) is 90% genetically determined.
Yeah.
When you hear people with super high Lp(a), do you use it almost like cascade genetics?
Yeah. So thanks for pointing that out. So what I think probably one of the most important things, so the guidelines in the US have not changed around Lp(a), but the European guidelines changed about 4 or 5 years ago, recommending that everybody deserves testing Lp(a) once in their lifetime. You don't have to keep testing Lp(a), it's a genetic thing. And the reason that that's helpful is it can re-stratify risk for the person, but more importantly, allow for cascade. And so we have, I'm happy to share this. We have a family letter that we send to anybody who has Lp(a) above 75. We have like a stock thing in the letter that the patient, they can circulate that to primary relatives. I'm happy to share that.
How is it cheating there?
Because it can so that's also another point. It's this I've never quite understood. So you could have like a dad who has Lp(a) of 400 or something, and their kids, it doesn't mean that kids are going to have LPAs of 400. There's not like a concordance of severely elevated or elevated, but there is a concordance of elevated. So once you find a family that has high LPA, it's very helpful to test everybody. We see a lot of 20-year-old, we get a lot of referrals for a 25-year-old healthy guy whose dad had an early heart attack, and we checked the LPA, it was very high. And the question is, what do you do with the 20-year-old? And so, that actually is a surprisingly gray area, but so it's kind of a long discussion with the family and the 20-year-old to decide how they want to approach this. But it's really helpful in terms of kind of reclassifying their risk.
Question. So in terms of how do you weigh the potential increase of the LPA with statins versus kind of the benefit you may get from the reduction of the LDL?
Yeah.
Is that something where like you just say, okay, I'm going to drive this LDL down, down to like 30, or what's the thought process?
So statins bump LPA levels by 10 and 20%, and they increase them. It has been shown that if you drive the LDL as low as you can go, it still works for people with Lp(a). Now, I didn't have time to put this slide in, but one open question is what to do about baby aspirin in these patients because of that apolipoprotein A, that's that thrombotic sticky thing. Data from the Women's Health Initiative showed initially the signal that 55-year-old women that had a specific variant in their LPA gene were at increased risk for ASCVD, and they were particularly responsive to treatment for primary prevention of baby asthma. But nobody knew what to do with that because they were 55-year-old women. And so what do you do in a 20-year-old man? And what was just shown last October in a JAC, actually I can show the slide if it's of interest to people, but they looked at a much bigger study, a SPREE, primary prevention trial for baby asthma, and they looked back at all those participants' genotypes, and in that gigantic study, 50% men, 50% women, patients with a particular LPA genotype had increased ASCVD risk, and if you treated them with baby aspirin, completely abrogated that risk. So we are setting up a program with one company called GeneDx to, this isn't up and running yet, but it will be in a few months, to genetically test LPA looking at that variant, which would be helpful in deciding if you're going to put a young person on baby aspirin.
Can I ask one last question?
Yeah.
So you mentioned that the threshold for cascade screening is 75, even though we consider like 125
Yeah.
to 150. So is that based on data?
No.
Because it seems like you would capture a lot of people.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's based on the fact that you're outside the distribution of normal, and we know that your ASV starts to go up above 75. It's very small, but it starts to go up. And we also know that somebody who has an LPA of 100, their primary relatives could have higher LPAs. It doesn't mean that they're going to have an LPA of 100. You may catch an LPA of 400. You may also catch a primary relative, a brother or sister, of somebody who has a calculated 10-year ACP risk of 7.4%, and an LPA of 100 is, So there are now antisense small and siRNAs against LPA. I think as the group is aware, that are able to very significantly lower LPA levels by 80 to actually 99% in phase 2 trials. And there are several ongoing trials looking at cardiovascular outcomes of these anti-Lp(a) therapies. Horizon just closed last summer, but Ocean A, which is looking at olpasiran from Amgen, is just opened their enrollment. Unfortunately, the sponsor decided to only have one site in Boston. So we're not a site for this, but if you have patients who have established ASCVD and LPA is about 200 and really want to be in a trial, feel free to give me an email and I can put you in contact. This trial is in Brigham. I can put you in contact with folks there. It's through Timmy. And then there's two.
But you have to have had an MI. Or
you have to have had an MI, and it has to be like ACS. Can't be.
It's 200 is the cutoff.
For that trial, yeah. Ocean A was 150 for this one. And then there's two other antisense oligonucleotides in the pipeline. They're in phase 2 trials. And my hope is that we would be a site for concentration phase 3 trials. So I wanted to also just highlight SGLT2s and GLP-1s. And I wanted to kind of introduce this idea by, this has that there's a huge pool of residual ASCVD risk in patients with diabetes and with obesity. And that this pool has really been not significantly touched by current preventive therapies. And so the way I'm kind of showing this is in patients who have diabetes, when you treat an ASCVD, when you treat those patients with statins, they're still left with more residual risk for ASCVD than patients without diabetes who are treated with placebo. And so there's a huge untreated pool of ASCVD risk and this kind of metabolic disease. as I think we're all aware, it's been really complicated trying to target this pool of risk. I'm showing data from 2008 showing that, if you try to be aggressive about lowering blood sugars and you drive A1C down, that resulted, as we're all aware, in increased mortality and increased cardiovascular mortality. And then in 2007, there was really concerning data from meta-analyses showing that if you try to reduce cardiovascular risk in patients with diabetes with rosaclism, it led to a 43% increased risk for MI and a 64% increased risk of death from cardiovascular disease, which was surprising and alarming. And that led the FDA to issue guidance in 2008 that all new anti-hyperglycemic meds developed for diabetes had to undergo cardiovascular outcome trials for safety. And this really is what led to the development of SGLT2s and GLP-1s. And just this, for SGLT2s, I just wanted to make the point that interest in SGLT2s has been ongoing for 150 years. That Florizin was, which is what empagliflozin is modeled after, was first isolated from the bark of an apple tree 150 years ago. And it was figured out that this caused glucosuria in the 1880s. It was figured out that this inhibits, what this does, what inhibitors of SGLT2 do is SGLT2 reabsorbs 97% of filtered glucose in the urine and proximal tubule. So if you shut SGLT2 down, you can no longer reabsorb glucose, and you spill SGLT1 takes over, and you spill about half of your filtered glucose into your urine. So this is how these work. These were being developed as an anti-diabetic medicine, but then because of that 2008 FDA mandated safety trial, they underwent big formal CVOT, and it was a surprise that empagliflozin was not only safe, but actually lowered significantly MACE, death from cardiovascular cause, death, all-cause mortality, and hospitalizations for heart failure, which is not at all what the trial was designed to do. So this has now been, as we're all aware, shown over and over again. And when you look at meta-analysis across 5 trials of empagliflozin in patients with diabetes and ASCVD, they reliably decrease cardiovascular disease. The same story was true for GLP-1s. GLP-1s had, incretins were discovered in the 70s. This GLP-1s were actually identified in anglerfish because they happen to have the ratio of alpha cells in the pancreas are super high. So they actually cloned the first GLP-1 from anglerfish in the 80s. And this was being developed as an anti-diabetic medicine. And then only because of these mandated trials in 2008 did they undergo these large cardiovascular outcomes trials. Again, complete surprise, not only were they safe, but they actually led to a 26% relative risk reduction in MACE and non-fatal MI and non-fatal stroke, again in diabetes and ASCVD. This has been true across 8 trials and they're analyzed. I think the data are now very established. The problem is that clinical utilization of these meds has been dragging. And so these are data showing that, for example, in the pooled registry, which looked at 1,700 patients with diabetes and ASCVD across 119 sites, taken care of by 46 cardiologists, 90% of those patients were on guideline-directed statins, but only 8 to 9% were on guideline-directed SGLT2s and GLP-1s. We found similar findings at about the same time here at Beth Israel. These are patients, outpatients at Beth Israel who met inclusion criteria for EMPA-REG, taken care of by HCA or cardiology. This is back in 2015 and 2018, so the trials have only been around for 2.5 years. But as opposed, 90% of these patients were on guideline-directed statins, but only 8% were on SGLT2s or GLP-1s. That's improved over the years. It's now about 40%. But based on these data in collaboration with Dr. Gelfand, Dr. Chen in endocrinology, and then the LH pharmacy, we've actually launched a quality improvements initiative to look at the efficacy of a pharmacist-led program to improve utilization of SGLT2s and GLP-1s. This is all the work of Julie Kelly, who's an amazing pharmacist who's working full-time on this. You can refer patients with ASCVD and diabetes directly to Julie through an OMR order, cardiovascular drug management, that will then go to Julie. She will put patients on SGLT2 or GLP-1 in collaboration with you, but she'll talk to the patients and tee up the script. We've identified almost 2,000 patients taken care of in large part by cardiology here who would benefit from SGLT2 or GLP-1. About 60% of them are not yet on these agents. Julie is working through this list and has successfully got about 9% of these patients. She only started 2.5, 3 months ago. It's already gotten about almost 10% of these patients on GDMC. So this is a huge resource that I would encourage you to refer. What I'll do is just spend the last 5 minutes talking about, what I think, as I was kind of highlighting, I think a lot of these recently identified targets really come from new technologies that allow, and genomics that allow you to scan the genome for genes that are associated with ASCVD. And once you kind of find those targets, you can start developing therapies against those targets. And I think, the hope is, in theory, the next wave of these high throughput molecular profiling technologies will allow one to scan the proteome or scan the metabolome in a similar way to identify more targets that could be therapeutically targeted intervention. And I'll just say that it's now possible, I think, as most people have heard from from all of the work through Rob's lab, it's now possible to measure 5,000 proteins in a panel at a time, and in about 2,000 people a month. And the growth in this is that capability increases kind of by every few months. And what that high throughput has allowed is to scan the proteome in population studies. And so I think we're all aware of Rob's work, looking at the proteome in participants in Framingham, Harston, the offspring cohort. You can look at 3,000 people who were enrolled back in the early 90s, scan their proteome, and look, 10 years later, who of those participants developed diabetes, and was there a proteomic signature in their blood that you could have picked up. When you look at this, there are dozens and dozens and dozens of proteins that are significantly associated with the risk of developing diabetes 10 years down the road. Some of the top hits are well-known players in glucose and insulin homeostasis, like adiponectin, steroid hormone binding, globulin, PI1, et cetera. But several of the top hits have totally unexplored roles in metabolic disease. In collaboration with Sejin Lee at University of Connecticut, and then here, we generated knockout mice of these top hits, ACY1 and WFPN2, and shown that if you do glucose tolerance tests in these mice, the knockout has completely abnormal glucose handling in these mice, suggesting that there's actual real biology in these, when you scan the proteome. And to take this a step further, when we've done a lot of work around one of these top hits, aminoacylase 1, which is an enzyme that's circulating in the blood, and it's very important in amino acid metabolism. When you inject mice with recombinant ACY1, or you overexpress ACY1 using a viral vector, you can see that leads to a really significant change in insulin handling of these mice, again suggesting that there's new biology behind these proteomic signatures, just like what we were seeing with the initial genomic studies. Zach Jonas in the lab is now working to figure out how the mechanism by which ACY1 is modulating this insulin handling, and if this could ultimately be targeted in diabetes and other metabolic disease. And I'll end just with one other, possible way of finding these new targets using these high throughput omics strategies. What I'm showing in this slide is, it's now, because of all the profiling that Rob's group has done, what we now have is we have proteomics, proteomics, metabolomics, and genomics study in large numbers of people. And so what I'm showing here is it's called a Miami plot, and it's 2 back-to-back Manhattan plots. And so what this is showing is that when you scan the genome, there are certain loci on the genome that are associated with circulating levels of metabolites and circulating levels of proteins. And what we noticed when we looked at this is that there are certain loci on the genome that have strong associations with both proteins and metabolites. This raised the question, can we use these harmonized data to start mapping out, piecing together protein and metabolite biological pathways? For example, thyroxine binding globulins of protein, thyroxine is a metabolite. Can we rediscover this pathway? Can we rediscover a pathway of a substrate, an enzyme, and a product of that enzyme? And so I'll skip over this, but we did this using Mendelian randomization. And this was really work driven by an incredibly talented MD PhD student in the lab named Aaron Eisman. We looked across 3 studies and we did Mendelian randomization in those 3 studies. And we found more than 200 hits tying a protein to a metabolite in a causal pathway. So these are really potentially new biology. And remarkably, when we looked in animal models and asked, are those hits potentially real? Well, if you knock out the protein that we're predicting is associated with the metabolite, and you do metabolomics in that mouse, more than 50% of the metabolites that we thought were downstream of the protein are actually downstream of the protein in the mouse model, which really kind of offers a new strategy to start looking at biological pathways. We took, for example, we took one of these proteins, CD36, another ApoE, and found that we predicted in human plasma and validated in mice that plasmalogens, metabolites, are downstream of these proteins and in turn are associated in a causal way with MI. So this is, I'm just trying to kind of show the next steps here, that this is starting to put a protein and a metabolite in a causal pathway with a clinical phenotype. And these are providing new points of entry for modulating this biological pathway. So that's the hope, that this is that this will kind of tail on the successes of genomics, may identify new targets in prevention. And I'd just like to thank, of course, the group in prevention, as well as cardiovascular genetics, hypertension center, BIDMC pharmacy, and everybody else involved.
Mark, thank you. That was great talk. Can you speak about obesity a little bit? Just because I always think about cardiovascular prevention, and you have such a great program with nutrition and everything. Seems like you may have the tools to. I really haven't had a lot of success with sending patients to management. A lot of our patients during the program at the nice one. Just don't know if thinking about some of the meds that you already managed.
Yeah. That's a great question. The question was, what about treating medical management of obesity? And it is like the number 1, 2, and 3 thing that we're thinking about. Now that we have medication for work, is if you in the short term, if you have patients that you think that you would like medical management for obesity, that BMI is over 30. And they have not kind of responded to lifestyle modification, feel free to refer those patients to Julie Kelly, the pharmacist, for initiation of GLP-1. She can coach. GLP-1s are sub-Q medicine, so she can provide teachings about that. In the long run, this is it's medical management of obesity is something that the whole PILA which is trying to figure out how to tackle. You need a whole infrastructure, you need counselors, et cetera, et cetera. So where that lands is, is still kind of figured out. But in the interim, feel free to send them.
We've had some success, I'd say the approval rate for that patient population without diabetes, it's maybe 20%, maybe.
Yeah.
As far as insurance stuff.
That's like one of the biggest barriers.
Yeah.
They work great once you get them on medicine. And yeah.
And it's seamless. I mean, she does an amazing job with it. It's just the hit rate's so low. And I find it funny with bempedoic acid because we're saying essentially that the bar for the prior authorization process is so high. But I suppose it has a lot to do with how nimble they are on pricing and negotiations, because we saw that bar rapidly drop with PCSK9 inhibitors. We're almost never running into a problem with the patients who need it.
I'm sure it'll drop. I don't even know. I don't understand why it's so high. It really makes sense that it's that high.
I just had one quick question related to that. I had a patient who's down in Sunshine State with an LDL of 61 and coronary disease, whose cardiologist wants to put him on a PCSK9 inhibitor in Florida because his small LDL particle size was high. So a lot of people come in, right, with the Quest panel. And I've used it to some extent on the primary prevention side to maybe shift like LP(a) to stat or not, but how often are you using it? How much value do you find in the non-LDL,
I think in that group, there's maybe kind of a renewed interest in measuring ApoB in that group. Like ApoB
primary prevention group or the secondary?
Oh, is that primary prevention or secondary?
This patient was secondary.
Yeah, in secondary prevention where they already get an LDL of 70, and you're trying to decide if you want to drive them lower. There's kind of a renewed thought that ApoB might be helpful there and driving ApoB down. This is a lot. The problem with that is you reach kind of a floor with existing kinds and statins, et cetera. And so that's a lot of ApoB, residual ApoB once you treat the LDL is tied up in what remnant cholesterol, which is like this related to triglycerides. So that's why all these anti-ApoC3 and anti-ANGPTL3 inhibitors are starting to come out, is to try to target that residual ApoB. So, I mean, the long answer is, I think it's operating totally beyond the guidelines. If the patient really wants to do it, and if they are willing to pay for it out of pocket, because it probably won't be covered, there's no danger signal that I'm aware of. So it's, I'm just really careful to say there's super guidelines. There's a lot of physicians get referred to this. I see a lot of physicians who want to put themselves on a PCSK9 inhibitor
For primary prevention.
For some for primary, that's tricky. There's some physicians who totally understand this and they're willing to pay for it out of pocket, and there's not really a harm signal. So I think it's probably okay as long as they understand what